Sensuous Terrain for mixed ensemble and percussion. What I'd like to do is just sort of introduce the piece and talk a bit about the process, and then introduce each of the 7 movements in a sort of very brief way. The piece essentially is attempts to be a kind of reconciliation between Eastern and Western musical thought. There was a time leading up to the formation and the planning of this piece where I was listening to a whole bunch of interesting things on my iPod, like Frank Zappa, Nusret Fateh Ali Khan, Messiaen, and a whole bunch of jazz. I always have jazz on my iPod when I'm running. And so the idea of this particular piece began to coalesce as a kind of synthesis of all of these various styles that I was listening to. And it occurred to me that within these styles, there's a pretty remarkable level of similarity between Middle Eastern music and Western jazz improvisation. And essentially this piece, The Sensuous Terrain, explores the interrelationships between those two worlds. I already mentioned Nusret Fateh Ali Khan. The narrative of the piece is guided by an ecology philosopher named David Abram, who I fell in love with when I heard him speak on CBC Radio as a podcast. His book, The Spell of the Sensuous, is an extraordinary book. Here's a little bit of his voice, and this is the kind of thoughts that really sort of blew me away. Oops.
Whether we are scientists or slackers, whether we're farmers or physicists, we've all been born into a culture that profoundly conditions and constrains our senses. And I think that this culture deeply conditions all of its members to not really notice the enigmatic wonder of the world that surrounds us on every hand, to not really notice that that world is actually there.
It's not a political statement, so this piece, I want to be very clear, is not some sort of political statement. It's really, more than anything, a kind of celebration of the similarities of these two worlds and a kind of meditation on the differences. Can you still hear me? Okay. Movement 1 is actually the last movement that I wrote, and it's got a pretty extraordinary graphic element to it. I'll show you that in a second. It was the last movement completed, and this primarily came about as a result of having all of these materials from the subsequent 6 movements in front of me to kind of use and kind of weave graphically into this first movement. And when I mean graphically, I'll show you that here in a second. There's a maple leaf in the graphic. There's a few other explanations for the actual name. Nusret Fateh Ali Khan is a Sufist spiritual singer. He died in 1993. He's really one of the great vocalists of the Middle Eastern tradition. And this intonation, if you will, is a kind of the summoning of all the musical forces in Middle Eastern music. And my first movement attempts to do the same thing. If we could play the sample here, this is just a little sample of Nusret Fateh Ali Khan's intonations. Oops. Okay, well, no, it's okay, I'll just let it go. Trust me, it's great. I want to move on with it. This is what the actual first movement looks like. Each of the members has a score, an actual sheet in their score that's 18 by 24 inches. And it was a little tricky for me to get them to use a traditional music stand and whatnot. It was not something that was going through my thought process as I was putting this particular movement together. But it's pretty provocative and a sort of reflection of my alter ego as a graphic designer. So there's lots of this kind of extended graphical material within the musical score. Movement 2 continues the ideas that are developed in Movement 1, but they really sort of coalesce. It's really kind of the opening movement, if you will. I'll quickly summarize this. There's basically two theme groups. One theme is based on a Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan piece, Shams ad-Duha, Bada ud-Duha. And the consequent theme, which I've been kind of waiting on for months, actually. I'd started this movement and couldn't finish it. But right after Michael Jackson died, I had his music played in my iPod obsessively. And this particular theme, the material, the melodic material for Don't Stop Till You Get Enough just kind of permeated the piece as the theme group B for it. So listen for that in the second movement. The third movement is a lullaby. It was actually the first movement written, and it was written, it began a few days after my son, John Henry, was born. He's 18 months old now, and it seems like only a few days ago that he was born. The time is just sort of flying by for sure. But David Abram argues in his book quite convincingly and beautifully that the air around us crystallizes conscious. Wait a second. Did I click that? Okay. So this one has some fragments, or at least some interesting musical elements from the Messiaen Quartet for the End of Time, the movement on the Louage movement. And there's an explanation there of the opening piano material, but I'm going to skip a description of that. Movement 4, which is quite an interesting graphical movement as well, which this one is based actually on this idea. And there's a particular chapter in the David Abram book called Remembering and Forgetting the Air, in which he talks about the air as the thing around us that sort of crystallizes our consciousness or our awareness of the living world around us. So this particular movement looks like this. And in this particular movement, I'm treating all of the various elements of the ensemble as separate chimes on a wind chime that's sort of being blown by fate or being blown by the wind or whatever. And so let me back up just a slide. There's, I feel like it's hilarious. I want to use this to use like as a laser pointer or something, but I don't think it does that. Oh, it does, or does it? Oh my gosh, it does. I have the power. I'm going to start over now. Okay, so there's some particular elements from Dizzy Gillespie's A Night in Tunisia that sort of rearranged in a particular way to create the ostinato piano pattern that you see right here. When we get to this movement, you'll hear that it's basically suspended by this percussion line here, which is just a very, very simple, smooth jazz sort of shuffle. And everything else sort of builds under that. And so what I did for the purposes of the graphics here, I've actually split it up into two slides so you can see a little closer. This is the left half of the movement, and this is the right half of the movement. Movement 5, Siptatelli Sleepwalk Ecstasy, is loosely referencing the Dumek pattern and Frank Zappa's Carolina Hardcore Ecstasy. This is a extraordinarily autobiographical moment in the piece. My dad, who's in the audience here, and for whom I've written and dedicated this piece, took me to see Zappa when I was 6, and I was sitting on his shoulders in the Armadillo World headquarters in Austin, Texas, when I saw this particular guitar solo from this particular album while it was being recorded. So, you know, the world has, in a way, a kind of captured, if you will, the particular moment that I was experiencing, and that led to the discoveries in this particular piece. So Why don't we play just a little of the solo if we have just a few minutes? I'm almost done here. This is just a small fragment of the solo. Okay, well, maybe it's not there. It's funny, Yvonne in the booth and I seem to be dueling. No problem, don't worry about it. Okay, so it's a really, really great guitar solo, trust me. I took the guitar solo, I transcribed it note for note, which is exceedingly difficult if anybody knows the guitar work of Zappa. This was a week-long chore in and of itself. I Middle Easternized the solo, and I used a kind of hybrid Turkish scale that I fragmented the result into kind of Stravinsky block forms, and then I created a piece from there. I'll just mention also, with this particular movement, I have the percussion 2 playing rocks and a can of compressed air upside down as a rhythmic element. So listen to that. The second to the last movement is a pretty huge violin solo that I wrote for Ertan Torgel. It's what it attempts to do, and it's called La Fin de l'Histoire, the end of history. What it attempts to do is tell in about 3 to 4 minutes the history of Western melodic experience, starting from Gregorian chant all the way through to the 20th century. And you'll know in this particular movement when we reach the 20th century. There won't be any question in your mind that we've reached the 20th century. But it references a really kind of ridiculous article that I read on the internet called "Will the Digital Era Mean the End of History?" And I don't want to waste a few minutes just talking about that, but suffice to say, this article sort of presupposes the idea that because of the digital domain, there is no need for history books, there is no need for archive and that sort of thing. So it was a sort of a strange idea. What I attempted to do once I surveyed over 100 composers from anonymous Gregorian chant through the early pre-20th century Wagner and a little Debussy was about the end of it. I sort of surveyed all of this through one extended solo, and then I leveled the playing field by sort of Middle Easternizing the melodies. So what I wanted to do, my goal with this was to attempt to see if I could discover what the true essence of the history of Western music is. As a result of this kind of leveling of the playing field, sort of applying this particular kind of nuance throughout the entire movement. And I must say that Ertan is doing an exceptional job with this, if you're really going to enjoy this movement. The last movement is a kind of meditation on a particular point in musical history in my research for this piece, where I discovered that Eastern and Western music, without any knowledge of one another, what their musical output was, seemed to be achieving or striving to achieve the same sort of things musically. So what it basically attempts to do is find a sort of place in the 13th century where the music of Peritan and the Notre Dame school, if you will, has this kind of similar kind of on-beat accentuation of notes, which is very, very similar to Middle Eastern music, though the harmonies are quite different. The structures of the music and the way the music is phrased, it's quite similar. Quite interesting to me. That's about it. That's all 7 movements there. So I suppose I could take some questions if anybody has any questions about the work. But my guess is that more questions will arise as a result of listening to the work. So please find me afterwards, and I'd be happy to talk with you afterwards. Any questions?
Any questions? That's like the end of Bernstein, right? The Candide. And so, yeah. Well, definitely. I know there are actually some folks that are back here. We saw it last night, and we're incredibly happy to have this jacket. Did you mention your website? Because there are all sorts of really cool things there as well.
No, my website is www.jackwstamps.com. There you can find all kinds of interesting things.
Thanks, Jack. Awesome.
Enjoy.